Okay, we come to this interesting and challenging aspect of responsibility principles. Mm. 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 Yeah, it's a big problem, this, and you can see why God's done it the way God's done it when you examine this more fully. So let's get started on the responsibility principles. Again, we have a number of terms to define. So we want to see that, again, responsibility principles are will-based and discussed in relation to self-aware beings. Of course, as for the governance principles, all creation has responsibilities, but most of it is instinctual, and therefore they are unaware of the responsibilities they are carrying out. Example of that would be something like the humble fly. It has responsibilities. The responsibility that God's given it is to clean up garbage. That's its responsibility, right? So it's one of its many responsibilities, of course. It has a responsibility to procreate. It has a responsibility to go into stasis when there's not enough food, and to then come out of that when there's too much. And so it has a number of responsibilities, but it doesn't know it does. And therefore it's instinctual. Whereas what we're talking about here is the human soul, not the body or the spirit body, being the self-aware being, ability to express free will. Therefore, we're going to talk about responsibility in relation to the human soul. So don't think the rest of creation doesn't have responsibility. It does, but it's not aware that it's carrying out what it's responsible for. Right? Whereas the human soul can be aware or unaware. Energy definition remains the same, development definition remains the same, and the power of governance definition remains the same. So it's exactly the same as what we've discussed in the previous presentation of governance principles. So energy is still the same thing. It's all information, energy, emotion, thought, and so forth. Development is still about our living in harmony or out of harmony with God's principles. And power is all about the amount of energy that can be expressed if we are in or out of harmony with the principles. So it depends on a relationship to development. So that's all the same. Now let's get to some new definitions. Nature is each individual human soul's God-given personality, attributes, characteristics, qualities, individuality, and primary fields of interest. So that's what we're calling nature. Everyone right with that? Yep. Now we come to the business end, if you like, of it. Self-responsibility is the law-based requirement of, now this is very interesting to see it as a law-based requirement. God's imposed this as a law-based requirement, right, of self-awareness. So God's laws require you to be self-aware. God's laws require you to seek truth. They also support you seeking truth, and they support you becoming self-aware. To seek love and understanding of all the principles of love and law. It's a requirement. See, most of you just think it's a choice that you can ignore, but it's actual requirement. And in desiring it to be a choice that you can ignore, you're basically choosing ignorance and saying, and then later on using ignorance as an excuse. You're basically saying, I didn't know, so I shouldn't have to be penalised by the law because I didn't know. But actually, the fact that you didn't want to know is an issue with God. Okay, so it's about the loving ownership and expression of one's will, desire, passion, emotion, attitudes, intentions, thoughts and actions in harmony with God's principles and laws. So it's the loving ownership and expression of one's will. In other words, God requires you to eventually get to this stage where you own the fact that you are a self-aware being and that you have free will. And to own the fact and then express that fact to the world. God's laws actually require you to do it. And all of God's laws support you in doing it. And all of God's laws actually encourage you to do it as well. So it's very interesting. It's a law-based requirement of self-responsibility. Now, this is where a lot of us have some deep issues, right? Because we're wanting to get out of having that responsibility. Self-aware beings, of which we are, must be given self-responsibility, because if they're not, then they can do a huge amount of destruction. Right? So this is very important. Self-responsibility is something you've got to eventually get to the point where you love to be self-responsible. You love to clean up after yourself. You don't leave your stuff all over the floor anymore. You know? You don't go around smelling like, high to heaven, then everyone around you can't handle you. You don't do that anymore. Right? You're a self-aware being who makes sure that they are self-responsible for every personal condition, including, and in particular including, their emotional and spiritual condition. Remembering spiritual condition meaning your condition of love, and emotional condition meaning all of the emotions that flow through you. You're also completely responsible for them. And this is where we've discussed emotions plenty of times in the past, and where unhealed, hurt emotions come from. And many of you have gone down the track of blaming your parents for the retention of them inside of you. And it's not their fault, because you are a self-aware being. It's your responsibility to learn how to deal with your emotions, your thoughts, your actions. That make sense? Yeah, very important. Now, role responsibility, which most of you want without any self-responsibility. But role responsibility is the assignment of specific roles of governance in God's universe dependent upon development of self-responsibility and according to development. So that should tell you that you're not going to get a God-assigned role anywhere in God's universe until you first learn to become self-responsible. Interesting, huh? You can see why, right? If you're not self-responsible, how can you be responsible for anything else? You can't, can you? It's impossible. Okay, so let's look at the principles. It forces the human to be self-responsible. Now, I use the term forces on purpose. Right? And the reality is many of you are happy to take self-responsibility for specific things, but then unhappy to take it for everything. Right? But God will eventually force you to take it for everything. And if the forcing doesn't work here on earth, the laws force you. And if the laws don't force you here on earth, what will happen is when you pass, you'll be in such a condition that that you'll become aware of what's happened, and the laws will force you there. It encourages the human to desire self-responsibility. In other words, it gives rewards to those people who are self-responsible. Does that make sense? Now, see here on earth again, role responsibility is given to people who are not self-responsible at all. We notice a lot in spiritual circles, The person's personal life is a mess, but he's up there teaching you about spiritual matters. But his personal life's a mess. Like, he has not even learnt self-responsibility yet. Why is he trying to teach you anything? Doesn't make sense, does it? To listen to a person like that. It allows God to reward true self-responsibility with role responsibility. And notice, God gives the gift of role responsibility to a person who is self-responsible already. It's almost like self-responsibility is like your P plates. Does that make sense? When you learn how to, with your P plates and you get pretty good at it, then you get your full license. And that's like rewarding you with some role responsibility as a result. Make sense? Clever little system. It's not a little system though. It's like huge. Yeah. Again, because the human has free will, the human is a bit different than other creatures here. The other creatures are given role responsibility and automatically are self-responsible. Right? All of them are self-responsible automatically, instinctually, and all matter is self-responsible, and all of it are given role responsibilities as a result. There's a, like oxygen has a role, water has a role. They all have specific roles. But because none of it is intelligent and self-aware, it doesn't know it has one. Only we, as humans, can see the roles that those things are playing. Okay, interesting? Yeah? Okay. Examples.